So our next speaker is Deborah Estrin. Deborah is a professor of computer science at Cornell Tech, where she runs the Small Data Lab. She's also a professor of public health at Weill Cornell Medical College, and she's a co-founder of the nonprofit Open Health. Deborah is a pioneer in the development of mobile and wireless systems that collect and analyze real-time data about the physical world and the people who occupy it. Please welcome Deborah Estrin.
Thank you very much. Where are my slides? Okay, no problem. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, so
right there it is, okay, really big in front of me. I got it. Okay,
okay,
we're good. I was worried about the transition from most of what you guys do, but Johan did an incredible job transitioning right over to behaviors. So thank you for that. He was the non sequitur, and now the rest of us are on topic for the session. So my interest is in, one slide too early, my interest is in this term that I came to call small data. Well, that happened because I spent a lot of time in 2012 to 13 preparing for a TED Talk, and they push you towards the cute. And so they pushed me towards calling this thing small data in contrast to big data. The reason I went for it is because it has some utility in that contrast. Big data is usually doing all kinds of very important stuff that a lot of people in the room do, looking across large numbers of individuals to try to understand things of all sorts, important in business and science and all things. Big data is good. Lots of people think it's overhyped. I think it deserves the hype, yes, sometimes over, but it's really important and good stuff. My focus just happens to be on all the data about an individual, things that people in this room also do, but particularly the time series of data that we generate through our interaction in the digital world. So this slide just showing you indications, examples of all those contexts every time we use our smartphone, social media, a search engine, our cable TV box at home, our loyalty card, our consumer transactions. All of these things leave these things called digital breadcrumbs somewhere in somebody's system. And those things over time create digital traces that say a lot about our behaviors. They say a lot about behaviors that are relevant to the research that you guys do. They also say a lot about behaviors that are relevant when you actually want to propose an intervention or try to follow through on some of the healthy habits proposed by Johan's cards. And that's really where I want to spend most of my time. I think this is now a time, there is all of that digital data. For the most part, I'm not talking about any new data. It's all data that you're generating anyway. You just largely don't have access to it. And so the notion is that if we can get the entities that capture that data for the purposes of running their own systems and improving their own systems, if we can get access through personal data APIs to our data, then we can build different types of apps and services that help us optimize our own lives in different ways. So think about somebody trying to manage dependence on prescription pain medication. It sounds like an easy thing to deal with unless you've ever been close to it, and it's really quite difficult. There's always, at any moment, you're trying to be an effective parent or a productive employee, and at that moment, having less pain is going to let you do either one of those. And yet it's longer term things that over time will put you in a better state to manage your pain without medications, whether it's yoga or losing weight or other forms of therapy that take longer but don't have that in the moment effect. And in general, that's the place where I think these small data can have most effect, is in closing the gap between what we aspire to do, what we know in some longer term is better for us, and what we choose to do in the short term. The opportunity to build apps and services that let us close that gap. So to be a little bit more concrete, and yet, of course, in many ways, I should make clear that this talk is still largely aspirational. We do a lot of prototyping of systems, but these are not things that are yet in full deployment, but certainly in this crowd, aspiration doesn't need to be justified or isn't unique. I'm just too short to see my own slides. There we go. One of the most important components of a determinant of health when you get past what you're born with is clearly what we consume. We were just polled about our interest in and our concern about GMO food, but in many other contexts, food is a very important driver, and it's a very difficult thing to measure. So you do get some subset of the population that in a rather consistent way journal what they eat and log what they eat, but that is a very difficult process to sustain. And for most people, and probably for most people who struggle the most with issues around diet, that is also a habit that's difficult for them to adopt in a sustained way. So one of the passive forms of data that informs at least what food you buy, if not what food you eat, that tells you what your food environment is at home, as well as with what food you eat outside, is around our transactions. And so, as an example, we're building a system that's about as cooked as this. The software is about as cooked as this drawing is. It's running code, but it's very prototypey and first generation, in which we get automatically forwarded the email receipts from your online grocery purchases. And we create a dashboard for a recommender system, who at the moment is a human being who knows something about nutrition, who sends you nudges and suggestions week to week around your grocery shopping. This is an important example, I believe, in part because it just is so easy and obvious and makes use of existing systems. And it makes use of existing behavioral economics theory. So there's a fair amount of literature and a notion of something called construal theory that talks to what we plan to do sometime in the future is often healthier, better, more aspirational than what we choose to do in the moment. And so there's the opportunity of helping people to move towards planning what sorts of food they bring home, exhibit willpower in your purchases once or twice a week in order to create a better food environment at home, so that you and family members don't have to exhibit as much willpower the 5 or 10 times a day or evening that you go to your pantry or refrigerator. Simple concept. How do you do it without a lot of self-report? How do you do it over a very long term? Because we all adopt better habits and slowly slide off the rails. Maybe somebody's sick in the family, we suddenly have a lot of traveling, things move us off of our aspirational behavior. How do we have some scaffolding under there that helps detect that and helps to move us back? So the opportunity to use small data, these are data we're generating anyway, we're not doing them intentionally. And we can have agents and services on our behalf that analyze those data and intervene with us and give us feedback to help us get back to that better self. And that's really the concept, whether you're talking about your consumer transaction data. In other contexts, maybe it's your language data. And so language is an indicator of many things. It can be an indicator of cognitive fatigue. It can be an indicator of cognitive decline, sentiment analysis. So just as we automatically get online grocery receipts and parse those and create an individualized and private pattern analysis for an individual, we do the same thing with email in this example. Particularly interested in private communication to complement what is studied in more public social media contexts. And so out of that email, we pull different language features and can host a number of different analyses from natural language processing. Just like in the dietary context, we don't care if the data, if you're online grocery shopping from Peapod and Fresh Direct, and we don't care if you're trying to follow a vegan or some other form of a diet. If you're trying to do something like My Plate, where you're just trying to increase the percentage of produce you're purchasing, or you're trying to do something more specific. It's about creating an architecture and an ecosystem with whichever direction you want to go, you have access to your small data and can choose your apps that are going to run over that data and serve you in the way you want. So similarly for language analysis, just to give you an example, a colleague of mine from Information Sciences up at Cornell, Ithaca, we were talking at South by as it happened, And he was saying that, fine, he's been wearing a Fitbit for a long time, his wife's wearing a Fitbit for a long time. They've sort of saturated on the feedback there. What he'd really like is something that looked at how and encouraged he and his wife to take more walks together several times a week, and to look to see how that influenced them. And he's somebody who's does a lot of work in this space. He said, I'd like to be able to do language style matching on the language we use and look to see how that correlates with us making time for our evening walks together. So we're, out of components we have, can do exactly that, because we can take both of their, with an application like Moves, which until recently was an independent application called Moves, which can run on your phone, either iPhone or Android, and it does the equivalent of the Fitbit, but far more, because it gives you location information. So you don't just identify that they're both taking walks at the same time, you identify that they're taking walks together at the same time, and look for those patterns, and then do language style matching off of their email feeds. And we're building an example of a health-related application in this context, is the ability to share more overall sense of how you're doing in a relatively, in a way that is still relatively private. So this was first suggested to me by a 75-year-old woman who sent me email, having read some stuff that I did, and said that she had a sense, she'd recently lost her partner. They weren't living in the same household, and she had the sense that she had missed signs of his decline. And so we started talking about, and have finally put together this sample application that takes basic information about location patterns and timeliness of responding to emails and amount of communication, and just lets Gert share with her small set of peers a kind of a pulse, a basic notion of an energy level that lets them identify not where they're going, not exactly how much they're sleeping, but some sense of the other person's well-being. And looking at this in context where there is a notion of both wanting to have a closer sense of an individual, but also wanting autonomy. So this is something that is, we're also looking at its applicability in the way that social services workers or health coaches would work with their clients, because all of these interventions, for the way that most people will experience them, will have a component of touch along with a component of the high tech. And our interest is in making that touch be as personalized and precise and useful as possible through the assisted use of technology. So we're basically creating an ecosystem where, as I said at the beginning, we can liberate that data by establishing these personal data APIs. It doesn't mean we have to have arguments about who owns the data. Whoever has captured that data initially, be it Amazon or Facebook or Google or Time Warner or FreshDirect, they still have that data. But making that data available to the individual through a personal data API, creating an ecosystem of apps that run over those data, because we all have different consumer preferences and we're going to want to use those data in different ways. And doing it in a way that gives us a fair amount of agency in terms of the choosing of those apps, and being able to run those in an open architecture and open platforms, ones that are commercial, but that give you a greater choice in that space. And so that's what we're about in the Small Data Lab, really bringing together small data with health-related behavior change. So I'd love to leave the rest of the time for questions or comments.
Anybody have questions? Raise your hand so I can see you. Oh, here you go. Introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, Jan from Paris. Thank you, Deborah. I wonder if you have entrepreneurs who are taking these ideas and building stuff, or if you are willing to build an incubator around small data. What's the plan?
Thank you. That you're acting as the person to prompt me to talk about Cornell Tech. So I recently moved just less than a year and a half ago from LA to this new startup itself called Cornell Tech. It's an all things digital and data graduate campus that is all about entrepreneurship and innovation. And we're sort of pre-incubator. So Let me give you this example of this thing that I'm particularly obsessed with, this push cart thing around grocery shopping, right? If we push it out the minute we have the idea to become a company, we need to have a revenue model. We need to make that partnership with Fresh Direct or Peapod. We need to make that connection to one diet or another. Okay? My background is the internet. That's my native tongue. Okay? So for me, we keep this in an open, build it and iterate context with open interfaces, and we make it so that it is going to work with Peapod and Fresh Direct and Instacart and whoever else comes forward, because now there's some standard format in which you represent these things. We call out to nutritional APIs, and we make that data available to whatever, in a way that any commercial service that wants to use it as part of their diet or behavioral intervention can. And ultimately, yes, it has to become commercialized for it to affect everyday people. But if we can greenhouse this thing far enough along and start it out as a community as opposed to a private platform, I think we better serve. And that's at least what we're about.
Hi. Thank you very much. My name is Matt Bates. I'm at University of California at Irvine. And I wanted to ask, so with getting access in these ways to your personal data, have you thought about ways to allow people to donate their data for research?
So this data donation is a really important issue, and it's always this other side, so thank you for letting me fill in what I left out. It should always be this other side of this notion when you mention the private word, because the sense that I have control over it, there are great things for which these things can be donated. So I don't work on that directly myself, but there are some people working in this, in this space, and I'm very interested in being a part of that community. I do think that when donation, it has to be in the form of anonymized, where there's a lot of work. I find that generally of less interest, because these data are particularly interesting in their very identified and anonymized form. There are people talking about, I know Jay Walker from TEDMED is very interested in questions about data donation after death, which has an interesting set of things. Of course, we all know that your data says a lot about the people you leave behind related to you, so it's not everything is so clear, but very important area. I think this is most likely to happen in the way we've seen it in particular disease conditions. You have somebody you love in your family who's had MS, you're going to probably do this and donate it for that purpose.
Any other questions for Deborah? Okay, so thank you very much.